AF, everybody. The weather outside is absolutely beautiful on this Friday. It's the perfect day to call off work. Except I didn't. I am recording this on Friday morning, late Friday morning, almost around lunchtime, actually. But not because I decided to have a little bit of spring fever and blow off my job. No siree, Bob. Okay, stop rhyming. Stop rhyming. But I've been flipped to night shift for the rest of this week, which isn't too big of a deal, because night shift with these folks is not like night shift at the warehouse fiasco job. Night shift with these folks is basically an afternoon evening thing, so if I went straight to bed when I got home from work, I wouldn't be going to sleep much later than I normally would on a weekend, per se. Definitely later than during the week, but not when it comes to weekend standards and stuff like that. So it's not like last time where I'm creeping home on the highway in the wee hours of the morning, hoping there aren't any drunk drivers on or something like that. But the odds are at this point that I will end my day doing some perusing at a local 24-hour Walmart, because it'll be a little too late to shop at another store and pick up some stuff here and there that I've been looking at. Some of it gaming related, kind of like what I want to talk about today. Hyperkin's Retron 5, a Famiclone, or should we even call these things Famiclones anymore? I mean, it's not like that Nintendo-based systems are the only things that they are replacing, so to speak. I mean, this thing does NES, also Famicoms and the Famicoms and stuff, Genesis, and Game Boy Advance type stuff as well. So a Famiclone, it sort of ain't. It's like a Genaclone or something like that, or a Game Boy clone, but that stuff doesn't roll off the tongue as quickly as Famiclones do. Of course, I have messed around with Famiclones before. My first Ashen's parody years and years ago, the one that got flamed all over the place by humorless Brits with no sense of humor, was actually me making fun of the Retro Duo back when I first ordered one and it came in. It was kind of like a spur of the moment thing, and it looked like something that Ashen's would make fun of, especially with its cheap quality and stuff like that. So I kind of just did an Ashen's parody, and I employed one of them horrendous sounding fake British accent for the entire, I think it was 15 minutes that video was, and yeah. I've been thinking of bringing that back with a classic series at some point later on, but I don't know. It depends on how many folks across the pond I tick off, with this being the first time I ever, I pretty much got a lot of feedback that I was like the next Lloyd Grossman or something like that, because this was pretty much the first attempt I'd ever done at doing that kind of impersonation for that long a period of time. And let's just say that when I listened to the footage afterwards, yeah, it is pretty horrendous impersonation. Folks who speak the Queen's English as opposed to the way us Yanks talk, to use their term for us folks here on this side of the pond, I can see why they're rather ticked off at my horrendous attempt at, yeah. Especially using the term garbage instead of rubbish. Of course, I didn't know about the whole rubbish thing back then. Anyways, the Retron 5 is the latest Famiclone to be tearing up the retro gaming landscape, to say the very least. It looks interesting, but as for now, I'm pretty much blowing it off. I mean, I canceled my MMO subscriptions, and I'm so busy playing quote-unquote real games that I don't even play my Retro Duo much anymore, and I've got games on the SNES that I still haven't gotten around to beating yet. I recently acquired cartridges for Yoshi's Island, and by recently, I mean like 5, 6, 7 years ago. I managed to get a hold of some cartridges for games like Yoshi's Island, Star Fox, Super Baseball Simulator 1000, which is a game I always wanted as a kid but never got. And I've had the Retro Duo sitting right there, and it's not being played. A lot of that is due to PC gaming. Of course, PC gaming is awesome these days, and is very much my system of choice when it comes to gaming this time around. Not very impressed with the PS4 and Xbox One, and I think PC gaming is going to pick up steam this generation as opposed to previous generations when Steam started taking off and stuff. But that's a completely different discussion. So I'm getting around to trying to play some more of these console stuff that I have sitting around. I got a lot of PS2 that I've barely scratched the surface on. GameCube, which I'm now using my Wii as a GameCube player because it outputs in progressive scan widescreen for GameCube games. even though the graphics system for the Wii part of it is borked, fortunately Nintendo did the smart thing and went with hardware emulation for the GameCube part of it. So the GameCube's graphics system is pretty much not affected. So at least I think it's hardware emulation, but it has physical GameCube ports on the side, which disappear on the newer Wiis that don't have the GameCube support. But I'm pretty much using that as a GameCube player, because if I don't, I'm going to have to play GameCube games on an older GameCube than the one I have, which didn't support widescreen and component video. It only went up to composite. Basically the cheap knockoff version of the GameCube after Nintendo made the absolutely stupid decision back then to ditch the component out because they didn't think people would be using it a lot anytime soon. Whoops! One of many little slip-ups on their part, kind of like the whole cartridge CD thing with the Nintendo 64. Anyways, the Retron 5 is selling out all over the place. Newegg, gone. Even Hyperkin. I think Hyperkin just can't make enough of these things. It's just all over the place. It is a notable leap for a Famiclone-type console, or should I say, a retro clone. That's probably a better term to use for these consoles. But I don't like the... actually, no, we'll get to that in a second with the price. But Amazon, the 800-pound gorilla of the e-tailing world, third-partied this SKU. Gotta get a shock mount for this mic. They third-partied this SKU, and the third-party person is gouging up the price. The MSRP is $140, and this distributor is selling them through Amazon for $150-ish, and there's only 2 left in stock, so even when people are hiking the prices, they're selling out all over the place. Well, I've made the decision, because of some other issues unrelated to supply and demand, to blow off getting a Retron 5 for a while, and it looks like that was definitely a wise choice to make. Now I get what the Retron 5 is all about. The Retron 5 caters to retro gamers who actually collect retro cartridges, as opposed to, well, I like to call them ROM ninjas or something like that, but people who prefer just play the emulation game instead and mess with emulators and ROMs for everything under the sun. It's basically how it all splits out when it comes to retro gaming these days. It's not exactly like in The Wizard of Oz when the good witch asks Dorothy, are you a good witch or a bad witch? But it's in terms of, do you want to mess with hardware or not? The people who don't do everything through emulation, whether it's through traditional emulators and ROMs, compilation games, which are basically emulators on CD for old games that get released on things like the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3. I happen to have the Capcom Classics collections for PS2 and the Sega Genesis one for PS3. I'm not too sold on that. And I also have a large library of virtual console games. The emulation world, though, you really can't deny the effect of the emulation crowd on retro gaming in general, because this whole idea of these consoles basically having emulators nowadays, like the eShop or the other stuff or the other places or things like that. These consoles having officially sanctioned emulators, would that have happened without the emulation crowd being what it has been all these years? I mean, I was first introduced to the concept of emulation way the heck back in high school when I had some nerd friends sneak ZSNES into school on a floppy disk. Yeah, we're talking way back here. They'd sneak it in on a floppy disk with a couple of ROMs and be sneaking games of like Final Fantasy or Mario 3 or something like that, or Super Mario All-Stars on the PC, and yeah, they tortured themselves trying to play old Nintendo games with a keyboard and suffering all the problems related to dexterity from using a keyboard and using your fingers instead of your thumbs to push the buttons. And oh man, the things, and of course there were, back then, this is Pentium 2 days, and there were technical issues, a lot more technical issues with emulators than we have today. I mean, I've seen the people doing like the angry video game nerd wannabe reviews of like Superman 64 on an emulator where the sky is purple, but we're talking going way back to when there would be regular graphics glitches, the screen wouldn't refresh properly. I actually saw someone playing Final Fantasy 2, aka 4 Easy Mode, the SNES version, on an emulator back in those days. And the emulator had so many technical issues that when the person moved left and right on the screen as it refreshed would roll. Kind of like if you run your computer with no graphics drivers and you try moving windows back and forth on an older, slower system, you might run into some problems with that. Well, this was actually normal operation for the emulator. So yeah, it didn't really get a good first impression, but emulation, of course, has come quite a ways since then. And of course, some folks out there are selling stuff catered to folks who use emulators, like those USB SNES controllers and NES controllers and stuff. Although I don't have any, so I haven't been able to really verify if the quality of those is up to par with the original controllers. But if you don't want to run the risk of not having quality controllers for emulators, there are adapters that let you plug all kinds of retro controllers into a USB port and use the real deal instead of some USB knockoff. So yeah, emulation's been making strides, but for people that actually want to collect the old cartridges, not so much, especially as console manufacturers have gotten the hint and they've started integrating some emulation features into more modern consoles. We've seen retro gaming with actual physical hardware fall behind. Enter the Retron 5, Android somewhat based hybrid thing, something or another, with 5 cartridge slots that play stuff from all kinds of systems and brings over some of the features related to that emulation usually brings to the table and puts it inside an actual box that someone can have on their shelf. Now, the thing with these kinds of retro clone consoles is that it's not like they're always going to perfectly emulate the original experience with the original hardware, and it's not like the original hardware is all that hard to find. There are techies and enthusiasts and electronics repair type folks out there who are buying up old NESs, Super NESs, and other retro hardware and fixing them up and reselling them. As a matter of fact, I already have my old Super Nintendo from back in the day. I could probably get a gray box NES, a Game Boy player for my GameCube, and then something for Genesis for less than the price of what the Retron 5 goes for. But there are some other value-added things as well. So, for example, if you have a lot of problems with worn-out batteries in some of these old cartridges for save data, and you don't want to mess around with changing out batteries in these cartridges, this system actually has save states and ways of moving save files onto an SD card. So it kind of modernizes the storage, although I am a little not so sold on the SD card thing because my question is, how proprietary is it? Suppose I get like a Retron 6. What happens to my save files that I've been piling up on my SD card for all the games I've been playing? What happens then? Or can I take them to PC? Will they cross over into PC emulators or something like that? I mean, that's the question. I don't really do too much with this kind of stuff. I mean, I prefer the real deal. And that's another, especially with controllers as well. And that's another thing that the Retron 5 brings to the table, is that it has slots for all the retro controllers. So you can actually plug in your retro controllers and actually play these games with the original controllers. And I happen to have a set of retro controllers around from a failed experiment with a Wii Virtual Console third-party multi-tap that was supposed to let me play Virtual Console games with the original controllers back in the day. But the button mapping didn't match for N64 and Super Nintendo, so I wound up just tossing it in the closet, where it has been ever since. But I still have the controllers from that failed experiment, and they would go quite well with the Retron 5. Another thing that the Retron 5 boasts is HDMI output and upscaling to 720p, which while I'm a little disappointed that it doesn't do 1080p, these are retro games we're talking about here. I mean, how much can you improve an old Super Nintendo game in terms of trying to upscale something that old for 1080p TV, even though 1080p is a popular TV size these days, and 4K is trying to break ground, so to speak, or make inroads into the mainstream market. This thing only doing 720p, looks like that's something they should try to improve with a patch of some sort. And fortunately, since this thing can be upgraded because it is running a modified Android type thing, they can release system updates for it at some point down the road. So I like a lot of its features, and I'm a little bit kind of on the fence regarding the whole 720p thing. And there's some other technical issues too, like for example, the system messes up and bugs out if you have more than one cartridge plugged in at any one time, which I don't get. I mean, why can't we just select which platform we want to play and we boot up the system? Another thing I don't like is, from what I understand, you have to hold down the power button for 5 seconds to turn it on, which is weird because the whole holding down the power button thing is usually something you use to turn something off. Yeah, I don't know what the deal is with the power button situation. And of course, not being able to use the included wireless controller to power on the system, which makes it just a tad different from, I don't know, nearly every other console out there right now. What on earth were they thinking with that design choice? Fortunately, though, I think maybe the potential is there that a lot of these gripes that people have with the Retron 5 can be addressed with some kind of update later on down the road, which gives me a good reason to blow off getting a system like this. So, looks interesting, but there's some things I'd like to see improved before I go spending this kind of money on a system like this, because I don't like the price tag either. My last Famiclone, the Retro Duo, was under $100. This thing is on par with the original Super Nintendo Superset when it first came, when I first got it in the early 90s. And I'm not so sure about this whole triple-digit thing for retro stuff, and I'm not so sure that's going to be too good of a, or something that's going to impress a lot of other people as well, because these kinds of retro consoles are often cheap chunks of plastic. The build quality often isn't up to snuff with the original systems and all that lovely stuff. And they've gotten a reputation for cheap build quality too. So to pay this kind of a price for this kind of a system, I think I'll keep waiting for the time being. There is something else, too, that I'm kind of scratching my head on. The supported cartridges are NES, SNES, Super Famicom, Genesis, Mega Drive, and original Famicom, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy. The Game Boy Advance thing, I'm a bit confused about, because if these systems can emulate Game Boy Advance, what's the deal with Nintendo 64? Is that going to be in the Retron 6 or something like that? What's the deal with Nintendo 64 with these clone consoles? Because it's not like I actually need something that plays N64. I still have my original N64 in fine working order, and I recently cleaned out the thumbstick dust from my controller that had been accumulating since I first got the thing back in the 90s. So I actually recently cleaned out the controller dust from the thumbstick on my N64 controller. So the controller works like new now, somewhat. A little bit wobbly because there's been some wear and tear on the thing, but it's still a perfectly fine system to play on. The only problem is that the Nintendo 64 has some primitive mid-1990s anti-aliasing in it that shows up all over the place on today's TVs. You'll see checkerboard patterns around everything in your games. It just looks awful. If somebody could make something that modernizes Nintendo 64 cartridges, I would love to have a system that does that. But this is what's got me confused, because this whole clone console thing was, from what I understand, the result of expiring hardware patents on old systems. So I think Nintendo actually tried to take action against one of the early clone manufacturers that started selling these little boxes and stuff like that, and then lost or something along those lines. But here's the thing. So NES and SNES, yeah, they're pretty old systems. Genesis, old system as well. But Game Boy Advance without Nintendo 64, it's not like Game Boy Advance is older than the N64. So, there must be some kind of technical hurdle to making one of these boxes that'll play old N64 games. But I always thought that the N64 wasn't on there yet because it was too new for it. But why Game Boy Advance? Although Game Boy Advance did have some backward compatibility with older Game Boys as well. But even the Game Boy Color, we're still talking about a system that's notably newer than the NES, SNES, Genesis, etc. Usually the argument is that these systems find their way into these clone boxes because they're really old. Game Boy Advance, though, is just the last decade. We're not talking early 80s or 90s here. We're talking 2000s. So I don't know what the deal is with that, but it'd be nice if one of these days I could play N64 games without having the checkerboards going every which way. And I actually do have some games on the N64 that I'd like to play more of, but they're just so much of an eyesore. I mean, I just got done getting a Wii U because Wii games were too much of an eyesore with the dying graphics system on my Wii, or the damaged graphics system on my Wii. Why should I have gone to all that trouble and then have N64 games? Yeah. I don't know what the deal is with N64 games on these clone boxes. Maybe some technical hurdle, some technology hurdle, some hardware patent not expiring hurdle, something along those lines. But Game Boy Advance without N64, just can't wrap my head around that one. So to wrap things up here, I get what the Retron 5 is all about, but for the time being, I'm going to wait on picking one up, especially if Hyperkin has plans for any kind of major system updates that are going to fix some of the issues that consumers are bringing up regarding this system. It would be nice if Hyperkin could polish some things up and then maybe do something about their supply chain so we don't see everything going out of stock like this, because obviously people are buying it up all over the place. So, anyways, something to think about. For now, I think I will wait when it comes to the Retron 5. I have plenty to play as it is. Till next time, this is MultimediaJay signing off. Thanks for listening, and thanks for stopping by.